What are you munching on? Gum. Um, I don't know. Trident, I think.
Yo, Trident's a good gum brand. Spearmint, dude, I like the blue one. That's what I grew up on. That's what my grandpa had whenever I would like want gum during work. Like the original, yeah.
Yeah. Um, Need some volume. There we go. Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sweet.
Cool.
Okay. All right, let me turn this off in the background. I'm still waiting on my updates from
From
my
Adam.
client. So yeah, I'm gonna pull up. So behind me on my computer, I'm gonna pull up my messenger in case I get interrupted.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So he hasn't gone on yet?
I think Classic Physique just went on, so probably is up there right
Yeah.
now.
He was looking
Uh,
really
yeah, yeah, he did good. It's his first pro show, so
Oh, that's exciting.
we'll see. We'll see how it does. You are a little quiet though.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's your, yeah,
I feel like I'm screaming.
my volume's up. I don't think it's me. Hold on, let me turn off. I don't know. Should be all right.
We'll roll with it.
Nah, it's fine. I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, cool. All right, we're getting some people jumping in. So, hello everyone. We are going to talk about bringing up lagging body parts today. So, we all deal with it.
Yep.
Most of us do, unless you're one of the few fortunate people that doesn't. That stubborn body part. Yeah, you raise your hand. Yes.
Yep.
Um, yeah, the stubborn body parts that seem like no matter what you do, they are difficult to bring up. So there's obviously like a level of trial and error that go into this, um, in figuring out how much volume and what kind of exercises and things these body parts are going to respond to. But hopefully, we are able to shed some light on some variables and things that you can think about and manipulate. So, why don't you start it off? Because you have obviously seen a lot of growth in your glutes and lower body in general, because those are obviously areas that we want to bring up for the division that you're looking at competing in. So maybe talk about first, maybe talk about the factors that have changed and things that maybe you were doing incorrectly previously.
Where did you fuck up? No, seriously, it's actually funny you mentioned that because I got a question the other day about like what was the hardest workout you ever did lower body, and I pulled up some training from a previous coach in Austin. It was 11 different exercises, and the sets were anywhere between 3 and 6 for all of the exercises. So this workout took me 3.5 hours to get through.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it was all lower body, right? It was all these different machine variations of like squats, deadlifts, frog pumps, booty band work, like all like literally 3.5 hours of hell, and like it didn't do a damn thing. And a lot of things that I
Right.
messed up, like it was just too much volume to where we were just like brutally tearing at my central nervous system and not eliciting growth, because obviously 3.5 hours of resistance training, you're just fatiguing, right? You're not really eliciting, you're not being able to bring the intensity that's needed to have productive sets. You're just burning the candle at both ends on top of like not eating properly and stuff like that. So for me, a big mistake that I made initially was just doing so much volume, thinking that that was the right thing to elicit growth, and not really focusing on fueling my workouts properly, and also not focusing on intensity. So I feel like that was my biggest offender, on top of having poor hip mobility, because I do have a little bit of hip imbalance, which most of us do anyhow,
Sure.
whether it's a true length discrepancy or most of us, we sit all day. So obviously we're going to have some imbalances between our hip flexors and hip extensors, whatever. But I had really weak like internal glutes and internal hip stabilizers, which caused issues. But working through that with like a physical therapist, as well as, believe it or not, growing muscle to actually support like proper hip stabilization, that has been really like paramount in just how my glutes have responded and delts have responded even with this like previous growth phase, even though we're using the lowest amount of androgens I've ever used in a cycle.
Yeah, so there's a couple things we'll touch on there, kind of break that down. Is first and first and foremost is we know there's like a dose relationship between volume and muscle growth. We know that you need at least a minimum a minimum amount of volume to elicit a response, and that could potentially go up over time as you get stronger and more advanced and things like that. But there's a lot of I mean I don't feel like I know there's a lot of steps that actually go into place before you even cross that threshold, and it is things like understanding your own mechanics, right? Activating the muscle, creating that neural connection between the muscle when you're training. Also even performing movements that are going to kind of suit your mechanics, and not so much it's not so much a movement itself that's not going to suit your mechanics. It's more of obviously like the setup of the movement and how you're executing it that might not fit your personal mechanics. So I think that a lot of people obviously fill in. They're chasing two things: either A, volume; B, progressively overloading throughout their training sessions, and are really missing on the basic fundamentals, which are activate the muscle, right?
Yep.
Create tension on the muscle through the entire set, right? So something that we had talked about that I had kind of brought up was like creating an equal amount of tension on the muscle through every rep in the set, meaning something that you'll see a lot in people that are a little more novice is they won't feel it until they get to the 10th rep of their 12 rep set. And of course that burn and that fatigue is going to accumulate through the set, but also at the same time you'll notice in a more advanced trainee that there's really a maximum amount of tension placed on the muscle, and that tension remains there through the whole set. You're not seeing form breakdown. You're seeing kind of like even more constant speeds in repetition. You're seeing less resting between reps. You're seeing this like kind of this kind of like piston type movement that's very tempo controlled through the sets. So I know for me personally, that's something that even over the years I had to revisit because I started to attain a certain level of strength. But then I'm like, all right, well, I knew that I could do more reps on a set if I went really fast through the first half of the set, right? Especially when you get up into those higher rep ranges, you have that tendency to kind of rush those initial reps until it gets hard. And really maintaining that tension it's two things. One, it's a skill, but it's also like it's difficult because mentally it becomes extremely challenging when you're getting into those later reps in the set not to start bringing in a lot of secondary muscles to do the accessory work for you. So for example, when you're doing a hack squat or something like that, that's a quad focused hack squat. If you were to watch yourself from perhaps like a side angle, you would maybe see the way that your hips are shifting or the position of your knees in the set. And what you're doing is you're starting to bias different muscles as the set progresses and as you fatigue. You're losing tension because that target muscle is fatiguing, right? And mentally, it's really difficult to maintain tension because it hurts bad, right? Every fiber in your body is like, hey, let us use our hamstrings. Let me use my glutes. Like, get this off of my quads, right? So that's where being more intentional and being able to actually like bias the muscle and stay in that. I'm always saying that when I'm training with people, I'm like, stay in it. Don't shift. Don't move. Don't rest. Stay in it. And that's what I kind of mean by that when you're creating that constant tension on the fibers through the set.
Yeah, I found for me, like that's why I don't count my reps. I video every top set because I don't want to focus on counting my reps. I want to focus on being like inside the movement. So that's how I get out of my head when it's just like I will be internally like cueing myself like it's just pain, like it's just pain, and then it'll be done. Or if I'm doing like God forbid a time set, which that's really challenging to do. Like I do 90-second Bulgarian split squats per leg, and it's like no matter how many reps I get, it's 90 seconds is going to go by. So you might as well just like keep pushing as hard as you can possibly push and just stay within the movement and just embrace that level of suffering and embrace that level of pain, because like once it's done, it's done. And I think a lot of people get like overwhelmed with like all the training variables that, you know, you can take into consideration when it comes to tempo, frequency, exercise selection. Should I be loading the lengthened position or the shortened position? Should I do dumbbells or cables or machines? And it's like, do pick exercises that you connect well with. Do tempos that you can maintain throughout the entire thing, and really focus on generating a certain level of mind muscle connection that can lead to the greatest output and the greatest intensity, and stick with it for, you know, a period of 8 to 12 weeks. And after that, then reassess what you're doing. If you're not seeing any change, go back to the drawing board and change one variable, right? Because that's what we're doing as coaches. We're changing one, hopefully, we're changing one variable
Sure.
without, you know, like just doing like a shotgun bird splatter, you know, across the board and hoping something sticks to the wall. It's like making one change to one variable and allowing those times and putting in those reps and checking those boxes to elicit a physique change. And that's really what we did with me. Is like I was able to take over my training because I wanted to prove to myself that I knew how to program, especially for bikini. And the challenge of me programming my own stuff is to not change it. Because obviously if you were giving me my programming, it's like, hey, this is what Austin said to do, don't fucking change it. But since I did it, there's that like little like, you know, person on your shoulder being like, yeah, but you can
Sure.
change it. But it's like, no, don't fucking change it. Stick with it for 8 to 12 weeks, and then if something needs to change, then change it. But don't use feelings, use data to support that.
Right. Yeah. So once you've kind of established the tension, once you've established the mechanics, once you've maybe established like what movements and setup and all the things that really suit you, then you can start to get into more nuance. And there are other, like I said, there are other variables that need to be set in place. Beyond that, things like doing enough. You still have to do enough volume to elicit a response. We can also, over time, manipulate that. Now, we need to look at volume as really two things. One, a total amount of work that we can do in maybe like say like a week's time or even within the training session and recover. And then secondly, where are we allocating that volume in terms of muscle groups? Because a lot of us, especially like women specific divisions, wellness, bikini, stuff like that, they are a lot more specific to certain parts of the body, whereas bodybuilding perhaps is a little bit different in terms of developing everything, right? So we need to try to understand, first off, how is the muscle responding to a certain amount of work, right? And then we need to understand, how do we take that work and distribute it out throughout a week, for example. So when we're dealing with, we'll use wellness and bikini, for example, because I think that they're good examples just for the simple fact that you're doing so much lower body dominant training a lot of the time, that what I've see now is, especially in like wellness, for example, is that it's just people are just making this a game like, how much lower body training can I possibly do? And the problem with that is that yes, there's a level of volume there, but there's also really no performance increase throughout the sessions. The reps and the tension, we're really losing all of that throughout the sessions because we're not able to maintain that performance. And we're just really doing a lot of like filler work that is not serving a purpose. So that's where, like I said, understanding how you can distribute that volume out and using frequency to your advantage. So what we should get into is talking more about how we can distribute out frequency and volume throughout the week for weaker muscle groups. Okay, and it doesn't have to be bikini or wellness. It can be bodybuilding. Maybe you want to bring up your lats, whatever. So first thing I like to think about is, if it is a muscle group that we need to allocate more volume to, what is our kind of like ROI, or return on investment, for the movements? So for example, if we're training your back 3 times per week and you're doing a very systemically fatiguing movement, like multi-joint movement, like a bent over barbell row, right? You're going to be able to handle a lot less volume on a bent over barbell row through the course of a week than you are on something like a chest supported cable row with a mag handle.
Oh yeah.
Right? Does that mean you does that mean you should never do compound movements? No. It just means that you have to understand that if you are only choosing heavily systemically fatiguing movements, then your volume is probably going to be cut down, right? So that's why I get kind of like, I roll my eyes a little bit when I hear about like volume studies and things like that, because volume on a barbell squat versus volume on a leg extension, I can do a hell of a lot more sets on a leg extension than I can do on a barbell squat, right? Now, does that mean one is going to be superior than the other? I mean, not necessarily, but when I'm looking at trying to find the best combination of enough volume and not creating too much systemic fatigue, I have to probably do some mixture of these movements to nail that.
Yeah, and what I did, like going back to my glute training, what I really focused on, for me, like I am someone that gets inside my head way too easily when it comes to perfectionism. So I didn't program deadlifts from the floor because like I just mentally just get inside my head way too much. But instead, since I noticed that I had a pretty big discrepancy between my glutes, is I still did one RDL, but I also did single leg RDL using a B stance variation. And I think a lot of people, because they're like big into doing single arm movements with lats or delts, for example, and that's great, but people are afraid to do single leg work because yes, it takes up more time, but especially in my case, when you have imbalances, like you can do different types of movements and do either isolation work or just, again, single leg work. And it's not as, taxing systematically because you're only using one leg at a time. So you're not really using like, a heavy amount of weight. It can be heavy relatively, of course, but, obviously for an RDL, I could do like hundreds of pounds, but doing a single leg, it's half that, right? So I'm still getting a good challenge, good tension on the glutes and the hamstrings without being able to push myself so far where I am getting those erectors kicked in, and obviously like using low back, which isn't the purpose of using an RDL, at least for me. You know what I'm saying? And so how I was able to kind of divvy up the frequency is doing 2 major lower body days and then 1 posterior focus day where it was upper and lower, but we weren't doing so much heavy loading. It was more just like creating volume and tension using like giant sets and stuff like that. But if you're doing a giant set, especially doing a cast giant set like I was, you don't need 5-6 rounds. I was able to do 2 rounds till failure, and like that was pretty much my glute training for the day because it was just enough to load the lengthened and shortened positions using various tempos and exercises. That's all the lower volume training I needed for glutes that day while I switched over to upper body. So it's being creative also with how you are designing your training. Like, you don't have to train 5, 6 days a week doing like shoulders, back, chest, legs, rinse and repeat. Like, especially for, women's divisions that are dominantly either lower body or delt focused, it's important to be creative with how you are training. You're creating your training structure. So, for example, I train Saturday, Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, and so I'm having like days off in between where I can like train legs and train upper body, rest, hit legs again, rest, and then hit a full body technically, but more of a bikini style training. So that way, again, I am respecting the division criteria while bringing up whatever body part I need to bring up. And in my case, it was glute max, glute med, and a little bit of side delt as well.
Right. So the way to kind of package all that, and I talked about this on, I think it was the last live that I did was
Jace?
Yeah, I think it was with Jace. And essentially it's what you're doing is the stronger muscle groups that maybe don't need to come up. You're essentially just training them at maintenance volume, maintenance effort, maintenance volume, right? And there's a couple advantages to that. One, you can kind of you're maintaining those muscles, and you can also it's also a way to break up some of the training, so you're not just hitting all of that leg volume in one session or two sessions, and you're actually able to recover session to session, because performance should be a parameter. Because if you're noticing that you're increasing the amount of something that you're doing for those weak muscle groups, but your performance is stagnant or even going down, you're probably doing too much.
Yep.
Right? So you can't just increase the amount and get weaker and recover less, right? Because it's not going to elicit the growth response that you want. So with those stronger muscle groups, you are training them at maintenance volume, and you might even be training them at perhaps even like a little bit less intensity sometimes.
Yeah.
Intensity, and we can talk about that a little bit. So intensity is a variable that requires a minimum amount of intensity to create an adaptation, right? Now, you're going to hear a lot of different opinions on this. You're going to hear people say, like, if you train to at least 4 IR or RIR or 3 RIR, it's going to increase, it's going to elicit the response. Now, that gets tricky because that's subjective, for one. But what we do know is that we do know that reps that are in close proximity to failure are considered effective reps. So as long as you are training your reps, the reps that are close proximity to failure, or your sets are close proximity to failure, they're probably eliciting some kind of adaptation, right? Now, you might want to perhaps train those weaker muscle groups at a slightly higher proximity to failure, like going to failure perhaps on some of those sets, right? And then perhaps maybe slightly less on some of the muscle groups that you're simply trying to maintain. And by doing that, you are now allocating more recovery resources, both from your nervous system and from nutrient standpoint, to those muscle groups that have a higher training demand, right? So intensity is an important parameter to not just train like necessarily exactly the same on everything across the board, because you could perhaps be cutting yourself a little bit short on some of those muscle groups that you are trying to bring up. And an example of that would be like, if I were to go in and I wanted to bring up my delts, and I was doing a push session with chest and delts, and I went in and just totally drained everything out, everything that I had out on my pec session, and I wanted to bring up my delts, that seems a bit counterproductive.
Yep.
Right? Because now I really don't have the nervous system capacity left to put that effort into my delt training. So when you're kind of trying to understand what intensity you should use within sessions, you need to ask yourself, one's like, how am I laying out the session, right? am I putting the most important exercises and most important muscle groups somewhere within the session that's going to allow me to perform the best?
Yep.
And then am I setting myself up to be able to perform maximally on those exercises, right? So if you're really, really trying to get a really good hip thrust and really good glute activation and really get strong on that hip thrust movement and get that, make your hips strong, make your glutes strong, but you're doing it after you're, at 90% fatigue level already, you're probably leaving something on the table there.
Absolutely. Yeah, that really goes down to like exercise selection and bringing exercise importance in order. That's something I get a question from clients like, is this exercise order important? It's like, well, yeah, it does, because obviously, like, if we're trying to bring up a lagging body part and you start training your strongest body part first, you're going to be allocating, more central nervous system output, more nutrient output to those fresher muscle groups versus you get into the middle of your, exercise session, or God forbid the end, and then you start tackling your lagging body parts. It's like, the fuck are we doing here? Like, that's why it's important to like follow that programming. I know for me, when it came to programming like other body parts, really it was like 2 sets maybe for like lats and my biceps and triceps, and yeah, it's within like 1 RIR, maybe 2 RIR, but all other like glute sets, shoulder sets, like, were either taken to failure, or since I have a training partner, sometimes a little bit beyond. We might do a couple of forced reps here and there, depending upon the exercise, whether or not it's safe to, make those reps forced and just going beyond failure. Or, you introduced me to muscle rounds, so I have a muscle round in there for my, like somersault squats or whatever the hell you call them. That is just pure pain, but that's another way to be creative and kind of save your central nervous system from fatiguing and not doing straight sets, is like using intensifiers, especially when you are in a growth phase, whether it is enhanced or natural, because that's ways that you can kind of push the volume and the intensity without like petering out so much. And so although like maybe doing a drop set on every single exercise isn't the way to go, because it's obviously going to be very fatiguing, using either muscle rounds or a rest pause or maybe an occasional drop set here and there could be potentially beneficial in accumulating that volume and those effective reps without, again, like taxing your overall recovery and digging you into a hole where we're no longer like overreaching, we're, overtraining to the point where we have to deload. And obviously, like, yes, deloads serve a tool, but you do want to be progressing on a consistent basis, especially when you are like in a growth phase, before you have to like, pull back and, rest up from that damage.
Right. So you brought up another good like subtopic we can touch on a little bit more, and that was the what I had mentioned about effective reps. And you mentioned a couple different techniques that you can use in there. So when you are trying to, again, add volume or add work to a muscle group, what you really should be trying to add is the amount of effective reps to that muscle group, right? So for example, if you are just adding in, you're like, okay, well, I'm doing a hack squat for my quads, and then I want to add more volume, so I'm going to do 5 sets of leg extensions. But if none of those 5 sets of leg extensions are training and achieving effective reps in close proximity to failure, then you're probably not eliciting additional growth response. Now, that gets tricky, because if you're just constantly doing more stuff, then you are accumulating more fatigue. So there are ways that we can definitely, if we are trying to kind of eke out those extra effective reps, like you said, using things like muscle rounds, for example, or cluster sets is what that essentially is, will allow us to have more effective reps in less total reps, right? So muscle round might be, in traditional muscle round, via like fortitude training, and I know Dr. Scott references, I'm trying to think of who the other guy is that had started cluster sets, but anyhow, essentially we're doing, a certain number of sets with a certain number of reps in succession of each other. So 5 sets of 5 or 6 sets of 4 or whatever. It doesn't have to necessarily be one set thing. And the nice thing about that is once you get to that third set, fourth set, fifth set, you're getting a lot of effective reps without a lot of total reps, right? So you may only be doing 4 reps, but 2 of those on every one of those sets is effective, right? Especially towards the end of that muscle round. And that's why techniques like that can be so advantageous towards hypertrophy. So, you're not accumulating a bunch of like unnecessary wasted volume. That's an issue that I definitely see people run into, because when you're doing these marathon sessions and you're adding all this extra volume and stuff, you just really kind of, for one, you get tired, you lose interest in the training session, you're not really as present in the sets and present in making the connection on the reps that you should be. And in turn, you're basically wasting a bunch of energy and not really eliciting a lot of extra response, right? So the sessions should be set up in a way that you can have the most effective reps without accumulating a bunch of unnecessary filler work, right? And that's where adding some of those special techniques can be lucrative. Can be muscle rounds. It could be a rest pause. Drop sets can be effective in there to an extent, as long as you're not doing like such long drop sets that you're just like moving a weight with no real like connection. You're just like tossing it around. I do see that a lot on drop sets. They're getting down to like these little minuscule baby weights, and they're not really even making any connection with the muscle because they can't move it anymore, right? So the reps still need to be connected, they still need to be focused, and they still need to maintain that tension, because when you get further into that pain threshold, people tend to lose that. They tend to lose that focus a lot. So yeah, really good points that people can use there. So other things I think that are important, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, but would be how we are actually spreading out the work throughout the week. So I see a trend sometimes, and people want to group, and I understand why, but people want to group certain muscles together that kind of are that complement or are secondary to the other muscles. They aren't grouping a lot of like antagonistic muscles together. So for example, you always grouping back and biceps. Why? Because you use your biceps with your back. Or you're always grouping delts and triceps, or delts and pecs, because you're using these things in succession with each other. But there's really no rule that says that you can't train your biceps on a day that you do your chest. Or I've even had people that do some lower body work in a day that they do some upper body work, and you can train these things, right? You can train these things in the same session. If you look at a lot of the better set up, like high frequency programs, you'll see a lot of that. And I had referenced like the fortitude training for the muscle rounds, but one of the things they do within that session is you train a lot of lower body with a lot of upper body, and throughout that course of that week. And so when I set up programs, a lot of time I will often use that technique, because for 2 reasons. One, it's a way for me to spread that volume out throughout the week and still recover. And 2, it's a way for me to train those muscles more effectively, because the other muscles I'm training are not really pre-fatiguing my target muscle, right? So if I want to get the most out of my side or my lateral raises with dumbbells, then maybe I'm having a hard time putting much effort into my lateral raises, because I have a hard time, not recruiting my shoulders when I do my chest work. Okay. So first thing there is I would want to try to fix the recruitment issue. Yep. And the second thing there is I would perhaps maybe even just want to like split those things up, or I could throw a real curveball in there, and I could even train my delts before I train my chest.
Yep.
Which, a lot of people see that and they're like, oh, you can't train the bigger muscle or the smaller muscle before the bigger muscle. And yeah, and these are things I see in program setup, and they're like, well, I can't, my delts are so fatigued, I'm having a hard time.
Yeah.
Because they are getting some delt stimulus through their pec training. It's just not as targeted as we're looking for, right? So sometimes I'll like, all right, cool. Why don't we move this out of the way? Why don't we switch the order of it? Or another example would be for exercise sequence would be, I have some girls that they are trying to bring up their glutes, for example, for wellness. And when all of their multi-joint movements, like squatting patterns, you could even say like, I don't know, like a hip thrust or something where they're driving off their feet. Maybe they're very quad dominant. They're like, all I feel on my squatting pattern is my quads. All I feel when I'm driving up in my hip thrust is my quads. I'm like, okay, so how about we do some quad training at the beginning, just enough as our maintenance, and then we've pre-fatigued your quads, and we can go ahead and do your glute training at the end of the session. You're still pretty fresh because we didn't go too hard on the quads, and that quad is a lot less likely to kind of kick in and do the work that we're trying to do on the glute training, right? So there's a lot of ways that you can kind of move things around and make the flow of the session work better.
Yeah, something that I learned from like John Meadows and watching his videos is like to think outside the box when it comes to your exercise selection and the order of sequencing. So for example, like, I'm not trying to bring up my chest, so I don't have a chest movement on my push day. I have a side delt raised using a cable, and then we go into rear delt work, and then I do a shoulder press. Or my lower body days, because like, due to the hip imbalance and sitting all day, like I have a little bit of that like hip flexor disparity. So rather than going into like straight into a triple extension movement or a hip thrust where I would be using a lot of quad just because they are weak and tight, I start with a lying or seated hamstring curl. So I'm already kind of getting that hamstring recruitment, kind of waking those muscles up. So that way, when I do go into like a hip extension or, like a hip thrust, or like I said, a triple extension movement, like a pendulum squat, which are one of my favorite squat variations, I am able to already have that connection because that tissue is already warm and the knee joints warmed up properly. So therefore I can focus on the posterior and not so much the anterior. But again, I'm also bikini and I am just trying to solely focus on bringing up my glutes, not necessarily my quads. But obviously if I was programming for like a wellness competitor, we might even start something with like inner thigh work, like adductors. Like focusing on the adductors and then the quads and then going into like the triple extension movements and doing a little bit of pre-fatiguing to get some stimulus, but not so much stimulus where like the quads are already on fire, they're already recruited. So therefore, when we go into like glute work, it's like, well, fuck, we're screwed.
Right, 100%. So with that being said, we can kind of summarize some of that because we talked about a lot of stuff. If we're looking at, and this order of importance isn't going to be the same for everyone because everyone has different strengths and weaknesses in terms of like what they're good at. Maybe they have great tension, they have poor intensity, maybe, whatever. It could be a lot of things, right? But first and foremost is creating tension while you train, okay? So that may come down to movement selection. That may come down to movement setup. That may come down to working through some imbalances that you have. Injuries may perhaps even play a factor in how, movement sets you're using. That's first and foremost. If you can't create tension, then nothing else really is going to serve much purpose. And especially being able to create tension on those muscles that you struggle with. Because normally there's a pretty good correlation between poor muscle recruitment and feeling the muscle and muscles that don't develop, right? It's not always direct, but oftentimes there's a pretty direct correlation there with most people. So that's kind of like first and foremost. So that may mean you just backtracking and slowing down and really trying to learn how to train that muscle.
Yep.
And once we've kind of accomplished that, the next thing we need to do is understand how much work we can do for those muscles that need to come up, right? throughout the course of, we'll say, a week. The third thing would be, how do we spread that out? How do we spread the work out throughout the course of a week that allows us to continue to increase performance, maintain tension, and continue to recover? Okay. And once we have kind of gotten all of those things figured out, we can start to get into more of the really fine-tuning nuance of how we're, executing our exercises and increasing volume and using the special techniques and doing all those things. But a lot of the time I find, even with advanced people, is they've been doing kind of the same thing, and they've been doing stuff for so long that we kind of have to make everything very elementary and just restart from the bottom and work through those steps to start to create tension on the muscle and start to build our workload up on the muscle, right? And once you do that, as long as you obviously are supporting yourself, there's of course a bunch of environmental factors, supporting yourself with sleep and nutrition and all these things, you're going to grow. The muscles are going to grow. So this requires a lot. This requires you not being emotionally attached to certain exercises. This requires you to not be emotionally attached to certain ways of training, to certain rep ranges, to really any of that stuff. Because as you become more advanced, you do have to become more specific.
Yep.
There's a lot of exercises that I used to do that I don't really do much anymore because I just don't get a lot of return on investment from them. I maybe got too developed in one area versus another. I was not able to recruit the muscles the way I wanted to. And that's often why you do see, and I never quite understood this when I was really young and starting training. I'm like, why do some of these really advanced people do like a lot of machines and a lot of machine work? Right. Well, they're doing it because they can place they can get set up in a way where they can really focus on the fibers that they want to recruit and generate the most tension and the most intensity and the most bias towards the muscle as possible without unnecessary systemic fatigue, with preventing injury and all these things. So the order of importance does get a little bit different as you get more advanced.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really what worked for me. And yeah,
awesome.
Official.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a lot of good takeaways there. Like I said, I didn't want to come on and say like you need to do this many sets for your glutes to make them grow, because it's just an arbitrary number. But you definitely don't want to get in the habit of just trying to indefinitely do more of something without nailing down the fundamentals and without nailing down those steps first.
Right, absolutely. Like, if you're doing 4 or 5 sets of every single exercise, you're just beating a dead door, or whatever it is, like your head against the door, or whatever the fuck that saying is. Like, just be programming, and like, especially when you are advanced or if you're competitive, like, it's okay to do specialization training. So I know you're focusing on your arms right now. Like, it's what you need to bring up, and then you'll shift gears after you are happy with the progress, and then you'll focus on another body part that needs to come up. And same with me. Like, we'll continue to do glutes, and then eventually we'll switch over to a little bit more delt work.
Yep, 100%. Cool. Well, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, and good luck to your athlete, Adam.
I appreciate that. I will reshare this, and I'll tag you and all that stuff so people can rewatch it if you guys came in late.
Cool.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Hope everyone has a good rest of your week.
Thanks, guys. Bye.